Now you've seen this thing many times, but we're going to take a much closer look at it today. What this is an air turbine starter for a jet engine. This jet engine. And there we go, our starter's attached, the airline is hooked up, start cart's in position, and Mr. Bill is warming up the fuel system so we get a little bit of light rain just before we run this engine.
Fuelless engines. The energy in air, Bob Thiele's compressed air engine. Bob Thiele's design is a compressed air operated engine and compressor where the operation of the engine keeps resupplying the compressed air tank. Scott Robertson's compressor system. Bob Thiele's system could do with some further explanation, so here's an idea from Scott Robertson. What you need to understand very clearly is that this is an exponential power engine. The output power is proportional to the square of the rotation speed. So double the revolution speed and you quadruple the output power. Also, the output power is proportional to the square of the rotor diameter. So double the diameter and that quadruples the output power. So if you double the rotor cylinder diameter and double the rotation speed, the output power goes by a factor of 16.
We have the engine manufacturers themselves saying that 90% of the thrust comes from the compressed bypass air and not from the combustion chamber. That's not me saying that. It's the people who design and make these jet engines. So it must be true, right? Yes and no. Let's get into it. To make sense of all this, we have to embrace the idea of the ether. The ether was a totally accepted element in the past. Before Einstein and his wife concocted the widely acclaimed relativity theories, everyone, including all of the scientists, knew the existence of the ether. In one fell swoop, Einstein got rid of the ether and everybody else followed suit. The age-old technologies used in the design of these aircraft and engines also utilize the properties of the ether. That's the bit they're not telling us. To do so would fly in the face of contemporary scientific thinking, and they would be forced to recognize the existence of this hugely important element. If you visit Victor Schauberger's Ripley's Believe It or Not page, you will find it sadly lacking in important information. This man was a master at decoding the secrets of nature, a prolific writer and far ahead of his time, yet the mainstream scientists chose to ignore his work and label him a nutcase. Just this fact should throw up a plethora of red flags with people. This man dedicated his whole life to the study of nature, and he came up with some truly fascinating stuff. Levitation, propulsion through the ether, and implosion technology, to name just a few. Let's start with implosion technology to show you that he wasn't just making this stuff up. As you will see in this clip, the gas that she's holding would normally be enough to blow a gaping great hole in her hand, but it doesn't. That's because it implodes rather than explodes. The force goes inwards rather than outwards. Implosion technology.
In 3, 2, 1. You okay?
You could judge by the loudness of the implosion that there was a great deal of energy created. enough to seriously injure her, but apart from being slightly shaken up, she seems fine. Victor's main body of work was with water, but he postulated and demonstrated that this technology works just as well in other mediums, one of them being air, or the ether. Air is our medium, water is for the fish, but the two are intrinsically locked together because both mediums behave the same way when coerced. These patterns and properties are used throughout nature, in the environment, in trees and shrubs, in flowers, and in animals. Basically, the whole of nature conforms to these rules, and Victor figured it out. As I showed earlier, Victor confirms that using the vortex idea on an aircraft, it will literally suck its way through the ether rather than thrusting against the air molecules.
Schauberger's central approach here was the principle of matter transformation. The elements of the air, particulate matter and gases are converted in this repulsator. One part escapes through the ring rotator, and the radiation energy, Schauberger talks about synthesis electricity, is emitted through the central axis. The repulsin creates a biological vacuum along the axis in front of it, into which the aeroplane is sucked.
The relatively small amount of fuel on board is used for takeoff, landing and taxiing. It's also used for the APU. The APU is the auxiliary power unit that's situated at the back end of most commercial aircraft. This is a small jet engine configured as a compressed air generator to feed the main engines at startup and during cruise mode, amongst other functions. Military aircraft like fighter jets use a lot more fuel than commercial aircraft. They need the extra power and thrust that combustible fuel gives. In cruise mode, a commercial airliner does not need the extra power as its forward motion is sufficient to suck enough air into the engine. Just a little observation here. The engines are designed to sit forward of the wings on pylons. From an engineering standpoint, it would be much easier to place them directly under the wings. As most people think, the jet engine spews out masses of superheated exhaust gas. If this was the case, then why would they put the exhaust directly under the wing where all the supposed fuel is stored? Next time you look at an aircraft, try and find the scorch marks under the wings from all of the super hot gases. You won't find any. The small amount of hot gas being ejected from the combustion chamber is surrounded by cooler, compressed air. Don't you think that these people should be in hospital with nasty burns from the super hot gases? Before we leave Victor number 1, let's look at his vortex principles at work in real time. If you think his principles are just theories, then feast your eyes on this. Like the jet engine, the Garuda-San Giovanni route needs a small force to start it, but then impels itself infinitely using the medium around it, in this case water. Despite the downward force of this water, the route impels itself even vertically, just as the jet engine does through the medium of ether. There is much more to talk about with Victor Schauberger's vortex principles and how the aircraft manufacturers utilize the natural forces of nature to assist flight, but I don't want this video to be too long. Again, check out Victor's work for yourselves and you'll see the connections. Time for Victor number 2. Viktor Grebennikov is lesser known than Schauberger, but his research and experimentation is just as extensive and important. It also derives its reasoning from nature.
It's a man named Grebennikov from Russia. Grebennikov was kind of a non-conventional scientist. He was an entomologist, did a lot of work with bugs, entomology. And his favorite thing was to go out into the steppes of Russia and into the various outer hinterlands and camp out in the summers and study his favorite subject.
This might look like a radio-controlled bee, but it's actually a bee with a little radar transponder on it, which means that we can track this bee as it flies around the field.
And these little guys can carry 90% of their body weight in pollen, so it won't affect the way it flies.
First of all, the bees are flying much faster than predicted, an incredible 30 miles an hour, even when fully laden. The next surprise is where the bees go. They almost always overfly potentially decent food. And once they've found their patch, they then repeatedly shuttle to and from it. And this is the really clever bit. In spite of 30-mile-an-hour crosswinds, whether out or back, they all fly in dead straight lines.
A bumblebee can't fly aerodynamically. Yeah, and he's right. And I said, well, what did bumblebees do? And they said, well, they levitate. And I said, well, how's that? And he says, come on, I'll show you. And he showed me, he wrote a book, incidentally. I don't know if it's still in print. It's in the Library of Congress. The book is called Tomorrow's Energy Need Not Be Fuel. And in that book, he gave reference to what I'm talking about, that, that of levitation, that the bumblebee, when he starts to beat his wings, when he starts to flap his wings, there's a little cavity, a hollow cavity next to the larynx inside his system that's hollow. And when he beats his wings, he starts to resonate this energy, and it goes back and forth, just similar to a guitar strumming on one side of the room and hitting the same chord on the other side of the room, or somebody hitting a high C and breaking a crystal. It's the same thing, it's resonance. And he said, what they do, they resonate. And when they resonate, they eventually reach the resonance of the field around them. And he explained it this way to me, that the Earth was, of course, spinning, but it was operating on a frequency of 8.5 hertz per second or so forth. And he says, once this bumblebee hits that resonant frequency of its surroundings, it becomes a free agent. It creates a magnetic bubble around itself, and it can go anywhere it wants. And I said, well, that's not in any of the science books. He said, I know. You probably never see it there either, but that's what happens. They'll discover it someday and bring it out, but it's just we have a conventional way of doing things, and then we have a natural way of doing things, and they're totally different. They're diametrically opposed.
The important point here is the bees. As you've heard, the bumblebee shouldn't really be able to fly. Those wings are way too small to lift that chubby little body off the ground. In fact, it's a bit of a conundrum also for the mainstream scientists. They can travel in perfectly straight lines for long distances without any deviation, even during a howling crosswind. Because of the resonant frequencies produced by the vibration of their wings, they create a bubble in the ether, protecting them from any outside interference. So levitation by sound waves is a real-world effect. You want more proof?
That the bug wings themselves were creating an anti-gravity phenomena under certain conditions.
These technologies are known and used in modern-day aircraft manufacture. The vortexes being produced are helping the lift properties of the aircraft. This is why the engines are forward of the wings. If they were underneath the wings, then the vortex wouldn't do its job. It has to flow over and not under the wing. Next time you fly, try to listen to the hum of the engines. It changes pitch when going into and out of cruise mode. Just pure speculation here, but there are large cavities in the wings, which are tested with compressed air and not liquids, by the way, and the engines produce a distinct hum, just like the bees do. As per usual, it's us, the consumer, who's losing out, while these huge companies are reaping the financial benefits.